and welcome to this third EBSWA webinar, and welcome to our two speakers who I'm going to introduce shortly. So the Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance was founded 2 years ago by social workers in practice and in teaching and research. And we were concerned about the capture of the profession by theories about gender identity, unproven theories about gender identity. We wanted to ensure that our concerns were heard, that evidence was openly discussed, and that the silencing of discussion which was going on was challenged. Some of you will have seen the crowd justice appeal for Rachel Mead, who I hope is with us tonight, who is taking her employer, Westminster Council, and the Social Work England regulator to an employment tribunal for suspending and investigating her for holding and expressing views which challenge gender identity theory. EBSWA is fully behind Rachel's challenge, and we had already written to the regulators asking them to produce their evidence for believing in gender identity and confusing this with biological sex. So this webinar is our third. The first two can be found on our website, where we also host blogs and links to evidence and research on the issues. And tonight's webinar features a psychotherapist, Sue Evans, and Betty, a committee member of the Bayswater Support Group, which is a parent-run group for parents of gender-distressed children. There's going to be a presentation by Sue and then a discussion between Sue and Betty on issues that have been raised by parents in the Bayswater group, which we hope will be really important and useful for everybody who's taking part tonight. And there will be an opportunity for questions. I'm going to introduce both of them properly, but first I just wanted to say that we welcome discussion in the chat function so people can chat away to one another, and we also welcome questions. But I need to say, please do not give any information in any of your questions or your chat that would identify any children or yourself if you have reasons to be concerned. This is not a forum for advice on individual cases. I'm sure everybody will understand it's public, anyone can register, so please don't post identifying information, as this could put children and their parents at risk. Confidentiality is obviously important. So hopefully social workers and parents, or both, will hopefully find the content helpful in relation to individual cases, but we don't want to feature any details of that, and Sue and Betty won't be answering, or me will not be answering questions in that in any way. So our speakers tonight are Sue Evans, a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. She worked for nearly 40 years in a wide variety of mental health services in the NHS. She was also a senior fellow at UEL and ran several training courses at the Tavistock Clinic. She retired from the NHS a few years ago and now has a private practice in South East London. Sue is a member of the British Psychotherapy Foundation and is registered with the British Psychoanalytic Council. And Betty, who's our second speaker, is a committee member of the Bayswater Support Group. This is a 400-member strong parent-run support group founded in 2019 for parents of gender-questioning children, adolescents. The Bayswater Group advocates for evidence-based approaches for managing gender dysphoria. Betty is the mother of a gender-distressed adolescent. So the format for tonight is Sue is going to give a presentation, and then she and Betty will discuss the issues that have been raised by parents, which are of particular interest and concern to them that social workers should be aware of. So they are going to just discuss them and discuss some of the issues around them after that. But before I hand over to Sue, I just want to say a few words about her background and experience, which will help anyone who's not aware of the work she's done on this issue to understand the depth of the experience that Sue brings to this. Between 2003 and 2007, she worked in the Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock, where she became concerned about the superficial level of assessment that some of the children received prior to being recommended for a medical affirmation pathway involving hormone treatments. As her concerns mounted, she whistle blew, and in 2005 to 6, a clinical inquiry occurred, but little changed in the approach, despite strong recommendations for further research and caution in this, what is an experimental area. In 2019, Dr. Bell made a report as a staff governor, which led to a series of exposés in the press and TV about the gender identity development dysphoria service in the Tavistock GIDS, or JIDS it's called. The Tavistock NHS Trust continued to deny their own staff concerns, and there was also mounting concerns from groups of parents whose children were referred to the service. Out of this, Sue met Mother A, whose daughter was on the waiting list for JIDS, and together they applied to the High Court in the UK for a judicial review. The now famous Kira Bell, a detransitioner, then bravely replaced Sue and joined Mother A as claimants in the case. They won the case. However, the Tavistock appealed and it was upheld, and the next steps are currently under consideration. So we might be able to have time to talk about the implications of that appeal, the ruling and the appeal. But that is Sue's background, and that's a lot of her credentials for speaking to us on this issue this evening. So I'm now going to hand over to Sue, who's going to talk generally of her experience and knowledge in this issue.
Thanks very much, Maggie, for that. Oh, I've got an echo. Can people hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm aware that there's an awful lot to say, and I'm aware that a lot of you may well be sort of across this subject. So I'm going to touch on things very briefly, but I'm quite happy to come back in our discussion with Betty, you know, and sort of enlarge on anything. I don't want to appear too superficial, but I've also got quite a lot to get through. So as most of you are aware now, that there's been a huge change really in this clinical area and in the clinical profile of the patient. So when I worked at JIDS, there were probably only 100 children nationally referred to the unit per year. And, you know, it's now up in the thousands, 2,000-3,000 and climbing. There has been, and again, I'm sure there's been more talk of this, the politicization of something that, you know, should be a clinical environment. And really that was my growing concern at the beginning. There was a sense that rather than things being informed evidentially and from within clinical experience, there was an influence, a bit of external influences coming in, and so the tail kind of wagging the clinical dog, so to speak. And it also became a bit more difficult to have clinical discussion. And for anyone who's worked in mental health, you know, or any area of sort of childcare, mental health care, you need an inquiring, exploratory approach to understand anything, because none of us are experts. You know, we're all learning about our clients all the time, but you have to be able to think, and you have to be able to talk openly and honestly. And that was the other thing that I became aware of, that as I raised concerns, I felt I oughtn't to be doing so, or it was frowned upon. And I think that that feeling for clinicians and social workers and teachers has grown and grown. And I don't think that's a very kind of helpful clinical environment for us to have. So you'll also be aware of this thing called the affirmative approach, but in case anyone's not, I mean, really what has gradually come about in this area of working with children with gender dysphoria or identity issues is this thing called the affirmative approach. It came from WPATH, the World Authority, so they call themselves. But actually, again, if one looks below the surface, one can see that there is both clinical information and participation there, but a huge amount of political influence as well. I'm not going to go into all that. I mean, there's so much in this area, but I don't think it's helpful for the purpose of this evening. But just to say that, again, there has been a kind of, if we call it a policy capture, I mean, I'm not saying it's bad in every area, and I'm not saying it's universal across the board, but what has started to happen, certainly in certain institutions, in certain county boroughs, in certain areas of the country, is that there has been development of what I would call non-evidence-based policy suggestions. You know, teachers are being told how they should manage certain situations. And I think the important thing is that we're always asking for evidence to back this kind of thing up. And I think, again, it rather ran away with itself, but we can come back again in the discussion with Betty, I'm sure, to that area, because you all have had some experience of that as well. But what I felt was that if I did take part in a judicial review, and if Kira and Mum A were successful, which initially they were, but certainly what's come about is a wider discussion in this area. And as you know, we now have Hilary Cass doing a review, an independent review, and NICE, who are involved in clinical guidelines, have been examining this. So there are a lot more eyes on this now, and I'm hoping that gradually we will have a more open and evidence-based clinical area in operation. And I'm saying clinical because that's my background, but obviously for you, what do you call it, Maggie? What do you call your area of social work? Do you call it client? Yeah, client area. That's helpful. Yeah. So, but I felt I had a responsibility, and obviously my husband got involved in it because he was the governor that resigned because he was trying to tackle this once he saw Dave Bell's report. From within, he was on the board of governors, but it wasn't working. So then he resigned. So in a way, we got pushed together in this. But he'd been aware of the concerns from my working back there in the early 2000s. So we started to think we need to put a lot more clinical thinking into this, and to write about, you know, what was my experience and the experiences I share with colleagues and both professional colleagues, but also the parents and the children that I'm now regularly meeting again and talking with. So we've written a book, it's a bit of a plug there, but we've written a book called Gender Dysphoria, and it just is a therapeutic model for trying to think about these children. And my background is in mental health and psychoanalysis. So that's where I'm based, but I'm not going to get too theoretical or technical, but I just thought that, you know, and it was suggested it'd be helpful to sort of just describe a bit about our understanding of what's going on for children and families in this area. And the other thing to say is that I have started to work with parents privately now as well, with families, because I think it's really helpful to kind of look at this systematically, sort of within the family structure. And I think parents have felt very pushed out at times, or just very lost in this, and understandably angry sometimes when they feel there's a cleavage appearing between them and their children and the relationship that they have with them. So I'll just talk a little bit about what I find, and again, I'm generalizing, every child is individual, but for the purpose of brevity here, I'm going to sort of summarize, and I can come back to things as and when. The thing I would say is that the children, as you're probably aware, who are coming to this are growing in number, but there has been a growing number of children who are thought to be either on the autistic spectrum, but certainly in some way sort of neurologically diverse, let's say, you know, people who, children who have a particular way of thinking, and the easiest way to describe that is sort of black and white thinking. But my understanding of that is that for many of them, they may well have, as they're growing up and developing, sort of not quite got the robust structures in place. You know, growing up development is a tough thing for all of us as kids and adolescents. But some of them, I think, have a particular sort of susceptibility, let's say, because of their experiences, because of the way their minds work. I think there's all sorts of social influences around as well. But let's say that there's some kind of fragility or susceptibility in their area, or in the area of their mind, that would normally be having to deal and metabolize the very ordinary frustrations, the slings and arrows of child life and development. You know, the rejections in the playground, the sense that other kids are more popular than they are, the feeling that they've been left out of a threesome and suddenly they're on their own, the feeling they don't quite know how to chat or get on with the kids in the class. They kind of Many of them can feel they're a bit sort of socially on the edge. And again, you know, we can talk about the kind of the way the internet has had a massive influence in this area. I think COVID again has piled in on top of that, but this was certainly going on before COVID hit. But children spending a lot of time online, not developing as many social skills as they might have in the sort of real life playground. And kind of there's a retreat, isn't there? If you like, it's like a sort of psychic safety place where some of them find, and one of the things I most commonly come across with young people, children, is that they say, I don't feel comfortable with me. I ask them to talk about how they came to feel that, you know, they feel they've got gender dysphoria, or they believe they're transgender or non-binary, and they say, I don't feel comfortable with who I was as a girl or a boy. And that's the thing I think that is really interesting to listen to, because much of my sense of what the children are doing is, in a sense, they're getting away from discomfort and they're trying to move to something that they believe will be more comfortable. And their mind sort of, that's why I call it a sort of psychic retreat, because there's something very believable. When they come across this, they think, here I am. You know, they watch a YouTuber, or they read something, or they go on Tumblr or Reddit, and they find a kind of reflection of some of these difficulties that they're experiencing for themselves in sort of fitting in and negotiating. Now, one of the really contentious areas is, and you may be aware that somebody in the States called Lisa Lippman wrote about this thing called rapid onset gender dysphoria. It's massively disputed. It gets shortened to ROGD. It's not an official sort of mental health categorization. But the reason I think both clinicians and teachers and social workers and parents are beginning to talk about it is because of the sort of explosion of numbers in this area, because of the amount of children who are coming to this. But the other key thing is that when I worked at the clinic, the majority of the children referred there, not all of them, but the majority were boys, and they had been expressing these feelings since quite an early age. And it was kind of fairly consistent. Now, even then, they didn't all go on to be transgender adults, but there was a sort of history, and parents could see it and they reported it. He always liked dressing in his sister's clothes. He always liked playing with Cindy doll or Barbie or whatever. And they would kind of report that. The parents of the group that are, and I put it in inverted commas, ROGD, but sort of are more recently coming to this, and their parents are more shocked by it because it arrives sort of with adolescence. Now, I think our understanding of that is that, you know, as we all know, adolescence is a very difficult time in the developmental life of us all. Hormones start raging, the body starts changing at the rate of knots, and the sexual aspects of the body become far more prominent. You know, boys become more like men and girls become more like women. So the identification with the sex becomes more apparent, as well as all the sort of the storm of adolescence, if you like. And again, I feel horrible here. I hope I'm not teaching you to suck eggs, but I think it's so important, I think, to try and understand the current explosion in some dynamic of sort of child adolescent development, and how really difficult I think it is for kids today, with the online world, with the pressures of, you know, social forum, the bullying, the perfectionism, the sort of the world that I think anyone of our age just can't comprehend really. But I think it's a really challenging environment for kids, and they aren't trying things out as much in the real world, because they're a lot of the time in their computers, they're online, they're gaming, they've got oh god, I've forgotten the word from not motivars, when they have their, oh, someone help me out, they have their characters that they play as, or avatars, there we are, I got there in the end. old age, so it's too late in the day for me. So, but yeah, the sort of avatars. And again, the way of understanding that is that there's a way instead of being kind of with them, their awkward selves that's not fitting in, that's feeling, I don't feel comfortable, I don't want to think about sex, I don't know if I like girls, I don't know if I like boys, you know, there's a that their world has really changed from the one I think that sort of my generation certainly inhabited. So I think that's around. And then just to say a bit more about, and I don't know how many of you are coming across children expressing this, and there may be parents in the audience as well, but things can seem really fixed and rigid. And I think it causes huge problems between the parents and the children, because the children think they've found their answer and the parents just can't believe it, can't understand it, can't recognize the child, that the child is trying to describe. And again, I think there's a way in which if we try to think about that as a sort of a dynamic that has been hugely exaggerated by this change in our social society, plus all these political pressures, the sort of, if you want to call it, the sort of ideological movement that's come to bear in this area. So they tend to employ what I would describe as primitive defenses. So they can seem very black and white, very fixed. The flexibility is not there because they need their belief to be solid. And that's why I think it can be so difficult for parents and children to negotiate this, and often for professionals as well. And then if you add in on that the difficulty that now there's all this discussion about conversion therapy, and there's a real sense that you're transphobic if you don't affirm fully with the child. And of course, the child wants affirmation because, in a sense, they don't want the doubts that they were struggling with. They want to stay with their belief system, and they really believe it, you know, in that moment. Now, of course, what I'm now finding, even since writing the book, is that I think it's changing again. And I think there's a lot more kids coming in. They're not quite so fixed, they're transgender, but they're expressing this idea of non-binary, they're theys and thems, or z's and zers. But what they again are expressing is a sense of, I'm not comfortable with me. There's something about me that doesn't feel right. And I suppose in any area, obviously my interest is in mental health work and psychology, but I think in any area, whether it's teachers, social workers, parents, you know, peer groups, not so much peer groups because it's more difficult for them because it's what they're dealing with, but sort of within this area is to keep alive the sort of idea that as adults, in a way, we've perhaps developed more capacity to think around this and to explore this. But for the children, that there is a way in which, and again, even what I'm saying now, it would be denounced, it would be, you know, I don't know what I'm talking about because these children are being their true selves. But I've worked a lot in this area, and I honestly feel, and I'm not saying everyone's got a mental health illness, but what I'm saying is when you look more closely and in a more nuanced way and try and open up their thinking, you know, so we don't concentrate on the issues around the gender identity or, you know, the sort of physical fixations. I'm always trying to explore and open up relationships, feelings, friendships, likes, dislikes, that kind of thing, in a way to try and help them open up their mind, because that's the way I'm sort of trying to try and describe it, is that they've got into this sort of defensive state of mind to protect themselves in a period of real uncertainty and challenge. I'm just going to move on quickly because I know, how am I doing for time, Maggie? I can't hear you. Sorry.
Yep, you're doing fine.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So I'll just talk a bit more about the sort of clinical picture then. I mean, I think the thing is, again, you cannot generalize, but certainly in the children that I'm coming across, there is a higher incidence of what I would call comorbidities. Now, those can be subtle problems and challenges. You know, it can often be that there's a brother or a sister who's been very unwell and needed a lot of mum and dad's attention. But it could be a more, you know, more towards a sort of a depression or a real anxiety disorder, or some personality disorder issues. But I'm not putting everyone. But again, it's important that we don't say, oh, this is completely normal. There are things that need to be understood. And it's about trying to look at the layers of where the difficulties are. And that's, again, why I'm not in favour of just a blanket affirmation. I think it's always important to try and understand with the child what they feel and think about themselves. They often come across as being quite dislocated and out of touch with their bodies. So when they talk about things like surgeries, you know, and they call it top surgery, or, you know, they want T, girls want T, testosterone, or, you know, boys, you know, want to get rid of their bits and that kind of thing, that there is a way in which they will sort of be dislocated, as if the body is somehow not them. And again, you know, what I'm trying to understand and help bring together is a sense of body and mind. And the other thing that you may notice is that there's a way in which they're fixed ideas. This kind of, the solution they've come across means that they go, well, I'm not worried, and it's the parents that are really worried, or sometimes the teachers are worried, or the social workers are finding themselves thinking, this doesn't seem quite right, you know, I'm worried. The child seems absolutely fine. And it's that absence of anxiety, because of course ultimately some of the children may well go on to be transgender adults and live their lives that way, and that may be their best solution. But one would still think there are things to think about and consider. And so again, I try and find a way of talking with the children and that I see, which is, it's not about saying, well, you've got to be worried, and it's not about saying, well, you're wrong about what you think or what you want to do, but it's a way of trying to open up the area. Because isn't it interesting if you haven't got worry, you see, because these are serious things you're thinking of doing in the future. Now, of course, you'll know from the Kira Bell and Mother A judicial review and sort of what's been in the press around this is that you know, that there's a real challenge on whether children can give informed consent. And I think anyone who's worked with children and adolescents knows the huge developmental task that's around at the time. And in fact, if we're honest, into middle 20s. But, you know, in this country, there's a reason that people don't get tattoos at 13 or married at 13. And really, I feel what you're trying to do is help the young person develop a capacity to think about themselves and reflect on themselves, which is in a sense the very thing they're defending about by coming up with their solutions and their sort of physical focus on changing the body. I think they will try to project their confusion into others around them. So I think as professionals, we often get in real tied in knots because we're wary of misgendering or misnaming, dead naming. We're wary of our colleagues, you know, and will we be seen as transphobes, how we're pronouncing and so on. And of course, what happens is sometimes, and I've come across this a lot certainly when I worked in clinical teams, is people keep going, sorry, just remind me, is this a biological girl or a biological boy? Because they're going he, and then they're calling them Charlotte, and everyone gets confused. And my understanding of that is that in a sense, again, it's part of the defense is that the doubt and the worry and the anxiety has to be in the parents and the clinicians and the teachers and the social workers, you know, the professionals, because the child is trying to get rid of doubt, get rid of their anxiety. So that's my way of kind of understanding it. It gets projected into us. And of course, we end up getting confused often in clinical discussion, in professional discussion. The wish to control the way they are seen, and again, this is something that can be very, very powerful. Again, I think it's changed a bit in some of the the young children I'm now seeing, but certainly there was, and I think it's more so in the adult group, and probably what you see more of in the publicity of this is that there's a face to certain transgender identities, people who, in a sense, are absolutely affronted if people mispronoun them, dead name them. You know, they kind of talk about, you're literally killing us if you're deemed to be transphobic. And the way that I kind of try and understand that with the children and teenagers that I work with is that, again, it's connected to this wish to control the way they're seen, because I think they're so doubting and so critical at some level of themselves that they push that out. But then, of course, if you look at them and go, well, you're not really fitting the part, are you? You know, I don't really know that you're a boy or a girl. They see their own doubts, you see, reflected. And I think that's how I understand the anger and the attack that I think, again, as clinicians or professionals, we can come under, because it's so hard for them to kind of, in a sense, get that doubt put back at them, like to see it reflected in reality in the world around me. If someone calls, let's say, a trans-identified male who's dressed as a woman, who's, you know, fully kitted out, who calls them sir, they get furious, because I think somebody has reflected the thing that they're always trying to keep out of their mind, to the extent that some of them believe they really are a woman. And I understand that in that way, if that makes sense. But right, now let me just go. I've got a few more slides, but let me just quickly kind of brush over them and see. I think I've talked about the sort of need to try and understand the underlying causes of what I would call the fixed solutions. You know, what's the person defending against? And to try and understand their mind and their relationships, which can be threatening, because, of course, to think about themselves in more depth is more painful. And that's the irony of therapy, isn't it? Therapists make you feel worse, not better, in the first place. It's something that's always leveled at us. But in a way, that's part of the task. It's to support children and teenagers while they're trying to wrestle with their identity issues. And it's not to try and say they must go in this route or that route. It's just to try and stay with them, but try to help them keep thinking about it, rather than just kind of cutting it short. Because I think that's the other thing, and I'm sure other people have said that when you've talked about this before, but I think that as soon as you affirm, you're almost taking the child's options away. You're kind of removing a sense that they could look more closely at themselves, you know, and then it's hard to backtrack. And I do think that that's something about the very instantaneous way in which some schools have been affirming, and we're kind of being made to feel that we should, is that it's almost like taking away an option from the child. It's almost like saying, yes, there is something wrong with you. Yes, you don't fit girl or boy. Yes, you can't be a you know, let's say a masculine butch girl who likes girls, you know, or you can't be a feminine boy who likes boys, or a feminine boy who likes girls. You know, it's kind of removing that kind of flexibility and sense of feeling that they could fit in and be different. So that's sort of how I kind of try and work around that. So I'm just going to say a little bit about this, and I think this is probably going more into theoretical areas, but I'll just touch on it. I think one of the ways in which I try to understand working with the children is that the conflicts are often hidden. So very often the children can be very cooperative children. The parents will often say they're a really good kid, they've always been, you know, not a problem. I suppose if you think about the task of adolescence, you know, a lot of it is about rebellion, isn't it? It's about trying to get away from your parents and the identification, or the sort of the closeness with your parents, in order to become your own person. So I think the way I understand the struggle as a lot of the young people are experiencing, you know, in the sort of teenage through to young adulthood area, is that that they're trying, they know in a sense they've got to separate, they've got to kind of have the rebellion, and yet again, because of this sort of fragility, or maybe this sense of something around their sort of, I call it the ego, but the self that's not kind of as solid, or maybe they fear that their parents aren't solid, you know, they can't kind of attack their parents straight full on, you know, with the kind of, I'm going to wear this low cut top and my short skirt and I'm going to stay out late and I don't care what you think, mum and dad. It's more of a kind of a covert way in which they can sort of, in a sense, separate. And I think for girls, particularly with the mum, I think with boys it's a slightly different task, but I think when girls grow up, they're sort of like their mothers, aren't they? So I think it's quite a complex thing, and I won't go into it more than that. But in order to separate, sometimes they almost literally have to become somebody else. Whereas for boys, of course, they grow up close to their mums often, but then they become like dad. So that's someone different, isn't it? So they move away. So I won't go more into it. It's a rather theoretical thing. If you're interested in it, it's in the book, she says. But it's a sort of, it's the one of the things that I'm trying to understand is the way in which that young person is going to separate out from the sort of parental home. And so I think of it sometimes as a quiet rebellion, and all the arguments that are made for them online, in a sense, with their parents. And of course it works, it drives the parents, you know, to all sorts of areas that are really uncomfortable for them. I think I've sort of covered that in a very basic way. I don't want, because I think Betty's got questions as well. So we may come back to some of these other things I've got on my slide here. Is that okay if I halt there?
Yeah, that's great. And that, thanks very much, Sue. I think that was a really compassionate and also helpful insight into children's experiences and why, and some of the things that are really quite difficult for us all to address, because many social workers now are working with children who present with demands to change their gender, to transition, and all of the stuff as you described. But I think that was really helpful and much better than the kind of thin gruel of just affirmation and all the kind of the things that the guidance or this Stonewall and it tells us to adopt as an answer. It's so easy. You just take this answer, slam it on. And of course, many of us find this is very, very damaging to children and does limit their options enormously. So yeah, we've now got Betty, who really helpfully on behalf of the Bayswater Group has provided a list of issues that they want social workers to be aware of. And so I think the plan now is for you both to discuss that. Actually, the issues are so good and so useful. I think that probably the Alliance we might use that as the basis for a briefing for social workers generally to be thinking about, along with your own talk as well. So, Betty, are you there? And do you want to
I am there. Yes, I can see you.
Great.
Yeah. So Maggie, thank you very much for inviting somebody from Bayswater to come on to this. What I did, I am a committee member, and what I did was I spoke with our members to say that we were going to be attending this webinar, and what sorts of issues would our members like people to listen to and hear about. I should say that quite a few of our members have either been referred to social services for not affirming our children as the opposite sex, or have been threatened by school and so on to be reported to social services. Some of us have had very good experiences with social services and our social workers who have understood the complexities of the issues, but other parents have had a more difficult time. I think that's one of the biggest problems that we as parents find, and it's not just for social services, it's across everything. It's across schools, it's across CAMS, that it's very variable. Some areas and some, depending on where you are, depending on who you speak to, some people will immediately take the affirmation approach and feel that if you're not using affirmation with your child, you are not supporting your child. Whereas other people and other areas seem to be more aware, and they understand that a gender distressed child who has a trans identity, that this may be arising from some other cause, and to take a more cautious approach and watchful waiting, and that by not affirming, say it's a maladaptive coping mechanism, by not affirming your child, you're supporting your child, you're not supporting the maladaptive coping mechanism, that sort of thing. But what the first thing we wanted to raise was, we would really like our children to be treated the way that any other child would be treated. So social workers, you'll have training in trauma and child and adolescent identity development. You'll have training in, children with complex mental health needs, autism, and so on. And so many of these issues, as soon as gender identity is mentioned, they seem to get pushed away and forgotten about, and that the gender identity becomes the focus, and that is the only focus. Whereas if you had a child with anything else, any other issue that had been referred to you, but no gender identity, some areas they'd be taking a very different approach, and the focus would be in a different place. And it's trying to work out how do we get the experts in different areas to understand that. The other next point was that the role of the internet, and Sue talked about this quite a bit, was that we find that the internet has been a great influence on most of the children whose parents have applied to join us. It can be anything from very specific grooming, where we found that our children have become involved in conversations with adults, talking to 11, 12, 13-year-old children, and championing them, saying, yes, of course you're trans, your parents don't listen to you, your parents must be bigoted, your parents must be transphobic. There can be a very, very heavy influence on social media, the internet. If you go onto Discord, you go onto TikTok, you go onto Reddit, TikTok has videos by the hundred of gender distressed children who are saying how wonderful it is to transition and so on. You get that encouragement there. You also find videos, not in the UK to be fair, but of, say, American doctors or Canadian doctors who are pushing their services for double mastectomies, they're pushing services for testosterone and so on. And even though those may be over in different countries, our children see those videos, and our children automatically think that is a solution, and it worries us. And we don't always feel that other professionals are aware of just how big the influence is of social media. And quite often, Sue mentioned the matter of informed consent, and people will talk about Gillick, but what seems to be forgotten quite a bit is that Gillick has a bit on the role of influence. And how can you say that a child is Gillick competent if you're not really looking into the whole of the influence? How much have they been influenced by social media? Can you truly say that your 11, 12, 13-year-old is making competent decisions when this is the bubble that they've been living in? They have this champion by everybody around them, and we struggle to understand how we can best express that to social services, to CAMs, to teachers, and so on.
And
I don't know.
Betty, you've reminded me something just before you go on to the next, but you've reminded me of something that's really important there, because one of the things that I have heard again and again and again from professionals, from counsellors, from parents, from social workers, is this thing that I think it's been propagated really, which is better a trans child than a dead child. And the thing is, it's complex, because there are some people who then want to go, well, that's nonsense. Well, it's not complete nonsense, because I think with some of these children, they have fragility in other areas. Some of them have comorbid difficulties. It's not right to say there's no risk of suicidality, but the way in which it's been sold is to make everyone terrified that unless you affirm, the child is at risk of killing themselves. It's not the affirmation. the difficulty is that some vulnerable children are more at risk of killing themselves. Children in mental health services, in CAMS generally, are more at risk of killing themselves than the general school population. The very nature of, you know, the beast. But I think that Betty, you reminded me, because that's one of the things that I think is so crucial to talk about, which is it shouldn't be used as a threat. This idea that suicidality comes about if you don't affirm. No, they're vulnerable, yes, and I'm not saying we don't support them and look after them in the same way, exactly as you're saying, Betty, as child presenting with other difficulties. But the idea that you get rid of the suicidality if you affirm is also nonsense, because they are still vulnerable children struggling with something, and they've kind of got their solution, but of course then their suicidality comes in as a detransition or a regretter in their 20s, because then they realise some of them realise that it hasn't worked. So thanks for that, Betty. You reminded me that part of it.
Yeah, and can I actually just lob in here at the you were talking about this, and I know you want to talk about mermaids and other groups as well influencing, but I suppose one of the things that's concerned a number of us is the the idea that the dangerous practitioners that there are within social work and within other professions, in that, like, I'm pleased, and I know that people can have good experiences where social workers are very thoughtful about this and actually support parents to be saying watch and wait. But there are actually some people within social work who are very ideological about this and promote transitioning and are quite bully. And I suppose that's a worry for us about how to combat that within the profession. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
It is. I mean, that's one of the difficulties we have as parents, because people tend to take one of two views. Either you view this as gender dysphoria, gender distress, and take the sort of clinical view of it, and say that, well, transition is potentially one solution for it, or one route to dealing with it, but there are other, you can do talking therapy and so on, ways to manage dysphoria. So people tend to either recognize that, or we as parents, we find that people, schools, social workers, and so on, take the view of the gender ideology view, whereas I don't know, they think is a gendered soul. It's something innate, it's something that is there, and it is not coming from an underlying problem. And that's where it can be very, very difficult for parents, because if you have a school that believes in the gender ideology, I mean, we have schools that have come out and said that they don't believe in gender dysphoria. They parents who think that their child is gender dysphoric rather than trans are wrong. And as a parent, it's incredibly difficult to come back and try to explain over and over again, well, gender dysphoria exists. It is a condition. It can result from many, many causes, and transition affirmation, that is one way of handling it, but it's not necessarily, well, it's not the only way, and it's not necessarily appropriate for every child. But when you have a school and so on, they're just saying, no, gender ideology. As parents, we're put in an absolutely impossible position.
I was really helped actually by Andrew a while back, because obviously I'm in contact with parents who contact me about the sort of clinical aspect, and but very often part of that is the sort of school and the social work challenge, that they're often frightened. And he very helpfully kind of said, well, it reminded me, it's a bit like in my area, I've spoken out about evidence base and in clinical work and about investigation and research. And I think he's sort of helpfully said it's the same, get parents to say something to the school and social work, okay, but every step I want the evidence base for this. I want it to be recorded, and it, if suddenly they're not kind of waving a flag and kind of marching on with something because they've been told to, if they then have to go away and read and make sure, if I write it down and I can prove it's evidence-based, it does bring a bit of what I think is a hopeful and helpful pause and kind of an opening up of something. Because I think, again, we were saying this, weren't we, at the beginning, Maggie? It's kind of left to the senior generation, in a sense, who've had our careers. We've begun to talk more openly about it. But I think now I'm finding that younger, certainly I'm talking to doctors and counsellors and therapists and clinicians, nurses, and they're saying, I'm so pleased that people are talking about this, because now we can talk a little bit. And they say, oh, I heard Sue Evans say this, or I heard Marcus Evans say that, and they could say the same about you, you know, that hopefully the conversations can begin a bit more. And it's not easy. There's no easy answers to tackling someone who is really sort of ideologically fixed, because they're as fixed as the children are sometimes. But I think if one can kind of say, but isn't it interesting to think about this? Isn't it interesting to look at the evidence, or to so that's the way I do it, is not to kind of tackle it head on and go, it's wrong, or, you know, it is or it isn't. It's to try and explore it all. I think that's the helpful way to
yeah, absolutely. I agree. Betty, did you want to, you've got some other issues to raise, and I'm conscious
we also wanted to raise siblings, the impact on siblings, because as families, we quite often find that the brothers and sisters of the trans-identified child are completely forgotten about. And the impact on siblings can be quite strong, because they can be torn between wanting to support their sibling, but at the same time, they can be very aware of the parents' concerns. They may well agree with the parent that is arising from different problems, but at the same time, they love their sibling, and they don't want to fall out with them. So it may be very difficult for them. In addition, from the school perspective, they can experience pressure. If they're at the same school, they can experience pressure at the school that they must affirm their sibling as the opposite sex. Their peer group may well be pressuring them to affirm. So we find that their mental health can also be impacted, also just by the fact that quite a lot of the time, the parent's attention is possibly disproportionately on the child with the gender identity issues. And so, it's trying to work out how we best as parents can support the siblings. And, if social workers are involved, asking that they not forget about the full family unit, not just the child that has the gender identity issues, but also the impact it can have on the brothers and sisters in the family. I don't know if Sue had any suggestions on siblings and how we handle this.
I mean, I don't want to get too much into the dark, deep plots here, but I think one of the most damaging things about this, is not only that the message really for young people is that you can't struggle with difficulty or difference. It's just, there are sort of physical changes you make, and somehow that will sort it. But I think also the damage that it's done to the sort of family unit, the way that parents have been set against their children. I mean, I do think there's something quite dark around it. And so again, and I don't know mostly whether we've got social workers or parents or a mixture in the audience, but that would be the thing, is to try and understand it in terms of the dynamic in the family, and not to get too fixed, on the rights and wrongs, or we must support and affirm, or are the parents transphobic. I think it's to think about the dynamic of the family, and to try and understand that something may be playing out. And so again, it's about having an exploratory kind of inquiring mind to try and understand the things, as you said earlier, the things that in the past, Betty, we might have thought, if a child has an eating disorder, you wouldn't just go, it's about that, it's about the body and it's about the body fat, and there's nothing else going on. No, you'd look at the family, and can you understand what's going on within the relationships, and who's neglecting whom, and who's being left out, and what the impact is on the child, and so on. But so that, I think, is a really important part of what's going on. That, my plea would be, again, is for social workers to kind of keep that more holistic view around, and that lack of doubt or anxiety in the child is one of the most worrying things. And I remember talking a little while ago with Stella O'Malley, who I think you've had on one of your previous, but she said it's amazing because you come across therapists who may have come across their first gender dysphoric kid, and they're the ones who think they've got the real one. And of course, what you learn in time is that every child, you know, they can feel very, very fixed, and there will be no doubt around. I know it all. I've got it all. That fiance, I'm going there. And of course, it's trying to understand why there is a lack of doubt, because it's too threatening. But I think for social workers or teachers or, you know, mental health workers to then join in that lack of doubt. Oh, if there's no doubt, it's fine, off you go. You know, where have our minds gone? Where's our understanding of childhood and adolescence and development and the family gone? And I really encourage kind of social workers to support parents. And of course, I'm not saying there aren't occasionally cases of Munchausen by proxy and abuse going on and that kind of thing, but I think it's also to really try and keep your, you know, what can we call them, the tinted glasses off, and to keep the mind open, you know, to kind of approach it.
I think somebody's just put in the chat about professional curiosity being so important.
And I know it sounds obvious. Again, I sort of feel like, well, what am I saying that's so original? But I think in this area, we've lost our professional minds because of the pressures that have come upon us as parents, as social workers, teachers, doctors, nurses. It's really difficult.
It is.
And I think for many of, yes. Sorry, Betsy.
Parents can also be under immediate pressure to affirm. And as a parent, if you were brand new into this, you need time to step back and do your own research and look into it and so on. And you need a breathing space. But quite often it is from day one, boom, as soon as your child says that they are trans, you must affirm that child. And just going on to talking about the family dynamics and so on, quite often we're the only people who are trying to take a cautious approach. You know, the child wants to be affirmed, the child's friends are affirming, the school's affirming, and social media is affirming, and we are on our own. We are the only ones trying to take a cautious approach. And if you come in, whether it's as CAMS or a social worker or as teacher, and you're effectively saying, no, we think you should be affirmed, we think your parents are not doing the right thing, that can so easily undermine the child's sense of stability within the family unit. So you already have a very vulnerable child, and suddenly you have these professionals who the child is supposed to trust telling that child or giving them the distinct message that their parents are wrong. You have a fragile, vulnerable child that all of a sudden feels they're not supported in the family, and that in itself creates its own problems for that child. You know, we can find raised anxiety levels and so on. And I think we really want all the professionals out there, regardless of their background, to try and go into this with an open mind and to listen to us as parents, because we do want to support our children. It's just we want to support them in the best way for them, and it's not necessarily through affirmation.
I know, I do see though that in the chat somebody has raised the issue of parents who don't have your the Bayswater group's concerns and watchful waiting, and the parent who says, no, support me, and you must do something about my child, transition them, affirm them. And so the doubting, you know, I think there are doubting professionals and doubting parents, but there is equally, or I don't know, equally, I think maybe most parents kind of, draw back and are very apprehensive, but there's certainly, we've heard of parents who probably for the reasons Sue was talking about, you know, they want to banish doubt, they want a solution. It's too frightening to think of, you know. So I don't know if you want to say something about that, Sue, as as a professional, to resist parents who are looking for a solution very quickly.
I know when I went on this morning, it was the first time I'd ever been on a kind of TV. I was absolutely terrified, and I think that, you know, they read these really quick questions out at the end and you don't get an opportunity to answer, but someone had written in, and I think Phil kind of read it out and said, you don't know what the pain is like, you know, if the child is suffering from gender dysphoria. And of course, I myself wasn't a gender dysphoric child, but I've worked 40 years more, you know, in this area. And I think, yes, of course, children are really distressed at times by their bodies, by their presentation, who they are. I see that. And I think it's so understandable that some parents if they read in the first place they get sent by their GP is the Mermaid's website, and it says the most helpful thing you can do as a parent is affirm your child, then you will affirm your child, because you don't want your child to suffer. And if you think the professionals are saying affirm, then you'll affirm. So I think there are parents who've done it, and sometimes I'm contacted a few months later by a bit like you're saying, Betty, that parents then start to read around it a bit and then think, oh, actually, hold on, maybe there is a bit more to this than meets the eye, and maybe we need to look a bit more closely. But I think then there are, of course, some of that is cultural, you know, and some of it is, you know, within the family unit, and it is pathological. There will be parents who can't bear the idea of a gay child, you know, and I think one has to address that squarely. The parents may want to absent doubt as well. There may be a whole problem within the family of managing anxiety and doubt and conflict and independence. So they're all kind of sucked in together. So then it's upon us, the social worker in this case, you know, if their referral comes through, you need to have the doubts, you know, and you need to then have a mind that says, so it's interesting. So there seems to be no doubts around this. You know, isn't that interesting? Because these are very serious steps. You know, there's potential loss of fertility, there's health risks, there's physical risks, there are, you know, and again, it's not to terrify people, but in any procedure, in any informed consent procedure, when you go to hospital, the doctors tell you about what the risks are, and they make you think normally, don't they? Well, if I have this operation, but I might die on the table, you know. Now, of course, it's highly unlikely you'll die on the table, but you would consider the aspects of doubt. Now, I think in this area, sometimes within a whole family, that goes missing because it's so hard to bear the pain and the distress that's around. So does that sort of help, Maggie, when you say, is that sort of what you mean? Like,
yes. Yeah, and I see somebody has put a question in which is kind of related to that. Somebody's put the last question that was asked is somebody saying, what about saving face for maybe an adolescent who's actually maybe begun to look at their own doubts or whatever, but it's too awful if, especially as we know now, some of these children are put on the stage at school at assembly to be congratulated for transitioning. So how awful to then have to, you know, to go into school and say, oh, I've decided I am a girl. So I don't know if you've had experience of that, of the detransition or helping.
Yes, and I suppose it's like in the same way that one supports the child going into this, one might support the child in a similar way coming out, which is just really to help them process the feelings that they have. I think genuine detransition is really, really difficult. And the most painful area of this, I think, is for people who've gone through this medically, physically, and then think, I've made a mistake. And for a man who's, you know, had his penis and his testicles cut off, or a woman who's taken testosterone and grown a beard and had a hysterectomy and a mastectomy, I mean, the work and the brave kind of work that they've got to do. And I think some people, they know they've made a mistake, but they stay where they are. And I think those are the people who often lead sort of a sadder life or a diminished life in some way. And again, I'm not saying everyone, because some people find this suits them. They transition and yay, they kind of feel better. And, you know, I'm not saying that that's wrong for them, but I think it's the caution. And that's why I think to explore it is so important going in. And I think to help someone if they start out is not to get too excited. If one of my young children's, you know, that I see starts to talk about adults, start going, oh yes, you know, it's just to keep exploring, because sometimes it goes back and forth. You know, there'll be another difficulty at school and they'll retreat into it again. So I think it's to think about it as a sort of psychic state that you're supporting in whatever way you can, in whichever profession you're in. But I don't think it's static, and I don't think we should think of it as static.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that's it's really helpful. Betty, did you want to raise any of the other issues that you have in the? I know there's a whole range. One was child protection, And you know, because many of us think that everything we know about child protection and safeguarding has been thrown out the window with this, but you had some issues there about the lack of protection of children, or
Yeah, well, am I allowed to give a warning about mermaids or not?
yeah, go. Yes, you do.
Yeah, a lot of, well, you know, many of our parents have found that either social services or schools or whoever have referred them to mermaids. Sue mentioned mermaids earlier. We have seen many screenshots from the Mermaids Youth Forum, and it's ages, oh, I can't remember, is it 12 to 19? It's something like that for children. Now, children are required to use a private email address with the youth forum. And within it, mermaids actively offer to send distressed adolescent girls free binders, even where they know the parents won't allow a binder because of worries about the physical health issues around it. And there are, you know, we've seen multiple conversations amongst adolescents recommending gender GP to themselves. Now, mermaids themselves have stopped you know, linking to gender GP on their website on the back of the national lottery concerns. But within the youth forum, certainly what we were seeing was a lot of children referring themselves to gender GP, saying, oh, this is the process, and so on. I think it's a very massive red flags. There's very little child safeguarding within that. And I would very much caution against professionals recommending that children and their parents go to mermaids, if I can say that.
I go along with that, Betty, and I think that there is another group which of course get called a sort of transphobic group, the Transgender Chend and Safe School Alliance, that seem to have a much broader, more evidence-based view of this. They kind of look more at what the law says and, you know, the do's and don'ts. But the other thing I would say as well for social workers is that I wouldn't rush to refer to GIDS, because there's this idea that they're the specialists. But what I know is, because of the turnover of staff now, it's almost entirely staffed by fresh out of college psychologists. There's one or two senior staff within the team as well. And I'm not saying that, you know, all the staff are awful. I'm sure there are some thoughtful people there. But I think, again, I would try and stay with local services so that the focus doesn't go on the gender identity. The focus stays on the child and the family for as long as, and again, I know that many of the CAM services have been captured, but I'm hoping that with the Hilary Cass review and the NICE review of evidence that's going on at the moment, I'm really hopeful that we'll get a slightly more nuanced message coming through to the mental health services locally. I don't know when. I could be deluded and I may be thoroughly disappointed next year, but I'm kind of hopeful, because I think there is so much more evidence now beginning to emerge. So again, I would not kind of rush to go to specialist areas. I'd try and keep it holistic and in the generalized area.
Yeah, I think it can be a bit of a consolation, I think, to certainly when you're been around as long as I have, and remembering satanic ritual abuse and the other things that seem to have swept across, and they've now all gone. No, you know, nobody is now insisting that there's actual real epidemic of satanic abuse, rather than just plain ordinary child sexual abuse or whatever. So these things can go. But I suppose one of the things you'd raised, Betty, was the issue of the LGBT. You know, so sometimes we feel like we've created a kind of created a context and an environment for children that's absolutely harming their mental health. So, for instance, Betty, you're talking about the groups in schools for 11 to 18-year-olds. And I suppose, well, I think you should maybe be good to hear you say more about those concerns and what actually happens in those groups.
Yeah, I mean, the concerns I think that we have is how appropriate is it for children from this wide range of age, you know, who are just entering adolescence to just coming out of adolescence, and yet in a school, in an LGBT group, they are all thrown together, and they're talking about, you know, its sexualities, identities, and so on. And it's a very wide range. So if you're 12 and you're sitting in there's, you know, 17, 18-year-old, you're coming from very, very different perspectives. And what we've also found is that some of our children the younger children can end up being mentored by an older child, and the older child is, you're probably thinking that they're very well-meaning and so on, but again, you have to question, is it really appropriate? I mean, what other sorts of clubs at schools have this sort of dynamic? Whereas most of the clubs, you know, they'll be about, oh, I don't know, there'll be sports clubs or music clubs, drama clubs, that sort of thing. And this seems to be a very unique type of club where quite often we find it's children teaching children about these issues. You know, they're quite often pupil-led. There'll be an adult supervising and overseeing it, but they are effectively pupil-led, and it can be older pupils with very younger pupils. And we wonder, you know, is that appropriate for this type of topic?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is you mentioned about satanic abuse. I think there are a couple of things around that. I think that mental health, my experience in mental health is a bit of a fashion business, you know. So, you know, eating disorders took off for a while, didn't they? And then self-harming groups, and of course they all go on all of the time. But I think undoubtedly there has sort of been a boom in this. It's become a hot topic, and unfortunately in certain countries it's become a real business, hasn't it, as well, a money-making business. But I think there is also a contagion, a sort of emotional contagion element about it. And whereas in the past a lot of the kids might have found themselves, I don't know, in the chess club or in the Ramblers, you know, or the train spotters, or, you know, you can tell how old I am, can't you? But, you know, that kind of, they'd have found their tribe in a different way, you know, and I think that, so I think there is you know, that some of these children are undoubtedly sort of mentally distressed and unwell, but some of them are kind of being pulled into something because it is so prevalent, and so I think there is a contagion element. I'm not saying everyone has it, but I think that's around as well, you know, and it's really important, I think, if there are parents as well as social workers out there, because some of you know, the sort of, you know, the crossover happens all the time, is that it's about trying to keep the very much more normal aspects of life going, you know. And that's part of the thing in our work with the parents, is just trying to help parents stay in their parental seat, like ordinary things, you know, phone away at meal times, or whatever your, you know, your rules and regs are, and kind of to not feel that you get pushed out of your parental authority seat, really, by the accusations of transphobia. You're allowed to have difference of opinion. Yes, darling, okay, you think that, right, you know, and how's your biology homework going? You know, that kind of, you know, but again, I think with social workers, it's often kind of helping see something around that, isn't it? Right, you know, and again, there are cases which are more extreme, but very often these referrals come in and it's just because a real misunderstanding about what's going on is developing.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of parental authority, if you like, and confidence is so important. And I think it's actually it's had a bit of a bashing in social work or by social work, because, you know, because of the sort of focus on child protection, which seems to quite often be social workers coming in and pronouncing to parents about and investigating parents. And that really rocks family relationships. If, you know, a mother finds herself under, you know, and the child knows that, oh my goodness, what's going on here. So I can imagine that playing out where the child feels almost like mum and dad are being corrected by the teachers and the social workers to tell them they must affirm them. That must be quite frightening for a child, I would think, rather than somebody just helping mum and dad to keep their authority and the confidence in a family.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking at the other questions. We had one, there was one about cognitive dissonance. I don't know if you saw that, Sue, and wanted to think it's about whether that high rates of suicidal ideation due to living a lie, if you adopted identity, that you know, might initially suit, but ultimately maybe counter to your actual sense of self. I suppose is cognitive dissonance. I suppose that you were talking about doubt and projection. Is that another way of putting
Yeah,
it?
well, yeah, I think it's complex. I think one of the things that I understand, my understanding of it, is once I explore it in real depth with some of the kids who have these more suicidal thoughts, is it's almost like they literally are thinking about killing the painful part of themselves off. Now, of course, they may well become suicidal within that. So again, it's about trying to understand it, and it's you know, it's careful work we all have to do in this area. It's not to be blasé about it, but I think, you know, that again, if one looks at it in more depth, one begins to understand, you know, that there's something so hated about themselves or about their past, because some people have experienced genuine trauma in their earlier life, not all of them, but some of them have, and some of it's trauma with a small t. You know, it's just the sort of the hurts that have been very subtle but have been really hurtful and traumatic for them. So I think there's a way in which they're just trying to kill something off. So I think the suicidality is linked to that. And of course, there they go. They give themselves literally a different name. I'm not the daughter you gave birth to. I'm a son who's created himself, or whatever. So I think there's that kind of suicidality in the mind. And of course, they call it dead naming, don't they? Because they have killed off that identity. But then there's the other thing that I mentioned, which is the disturbance and the distress. And adolescence is such a difficult time for so many kids. And I really feel so many of them are struggling now. It's painful to see. And it's like being sure that you're understanding, in a sense, the suicidalities. How much do they hate themselves? What are they trying to kill off? You know,
and also
just wanting to be rid of pain and reunited with some kind of pain-free, idealized mother object.
But just along with other, you know, developmental issues, children don't really understand death. So if you encourage them to separate their own self from this horrible body and think that they can change the body or what, you know, you do think that that's just yet another reason why, you know, that children, when they talk about suicide or suicides, even, it's not encouraged by mermaids, but when they say that it is a likely event to happen, you know, you can see why children wouldn't even understand the finality of suicide. It's, you know, which is yet another reason to go back to what we know about child development and how children understand the world.
And I mean, I've spoken to and worked with some transgender adults and transsexual, you know, what would have been called in the past transsexuals. And I think that, you know, some of them, even if they've continued to live in that way, they wouldn't so much say it's about society's transphobia. Of course that exists, you know, it exists in the same way that homophobia does, and Islamophobia and all the phobias that we have, and we criticize each other for all the isms. But I think, you know, that there are a lot of them that just, in a sense, know that although they've had their kind of solution and they've stayed with it, there is so much loss involved. You know, that the solution is not the sort of paradise that these kids are being told it is. It's not without its challenges and difficulties. And you know, many of them do lead, you know, somewhat diminished lives. Even if they continue with it, they have had losses to contend with. So I think, again, to understand their sadness or their suicidality is because, you know, they are continuing to try and grapple with their emotional internal worlds. And you know, so I think, again, it's to have the sympathy for that and understanding of it. It's not to sort of blame one thing or another, but again, it's that it's the individual hasn't found the kind of cure, in a sense, that they were hoping for sometimes. Some of them do.
Yes.
And that's great if they feel it works for them. That's, you know.
Yes, as an adult, yeah. And everybody has to, we all have to live with the choice.
We all make our compromises, yeah. For sure.
Betty, are you have you got other issues you want to raise? We're nearly nearing the end of time. We've got 5 5 minutes left. What else would you
I think I
want to-
covered most of them. Yeah, I think I covered them. Yeah.
Is there anything about what I've said tonight? Because obviously, Betty, you wouldn't have heard me do my part of the presentation maybe before. Was there anything there that you think parents might say, well, what was that? Or
No, I think it was very good. I think it was fantastic. There were certain points where I was thinking, gosh, could I email you and ask you to put these points in writing, you know, and then I can go show them to school. No, I thought it was very good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, it is all it's all recorded, so it will be available. You could invite school to watch it, and certainly it'd be available for anybody to have a look and maybe show it at parent meetings, and also for social workers to encourage, you know, in the spirit of professional curiosity, to be encouraging their teams to be watching discussions like this, having a look, having a discussion, looking at the research, because I do think the way to protect oneself in these situations where you've got, I suppose that's one issue that I'd raised earlier, that where social work has been actually considerably captured to the extent that you know, organisations are vehement that they won't accept foster parents unless they believe in automatic transitioning, etc. So we've had contact from social workers kind of asking, what can I do about this? I'm working in this environment where the whole team thinks that parents who won't transition their children are child abusers, and how do I raise it? And the advice we've been giving is about this, just exactly as Sue said, let's go, you know, let's find the what is the research, what's the literature, what does it say on every side? And I think, I mean, our position is actually so strong in terms of evidence that once the evidence is out there, you know, it's a much more secure position for people to argue from. But I suppose that's what we would be we'd be asking for, and we hope that these sessions and other things that we do are actually adding to people's ability to challenge and question. So just before we finish, do either of you have anything that you would like to say that you haven't said or haven't asked tonight?
Well, I suppose just to add to what you were saying there, Maggie, is in a way, I often think the way to bring things up, isn't it, is to do it vicariously through others, because I completely understand, because I used to feel quite ill when I was at work in the GIDS and I was trying to go, I'm not sure here, you know, and I used to feel really kind of unwell with it sometimes because it felt so uncomfortable. So I understand people's anxiety in the current environment. But I think to utilize articles or chapters from work, you know, or I mean, Marcus and I have written a couple of things for Quillette. You can look those up, and just maybe to get, if you do that kind of thing, I don't know if social work does that, but within clinical teams, we kind of go, we have a kind of education seminar once a month or something, and say, can we do this paper? Could everyone read it? Could we have a discussion? So in a sense, you're getting someone else to put the words into the group. You don't have to own it completely, but that can open up a sort of discussion. And as you say, there's so much evidence. I don't know if people are aware of the organisation SEGM, SEGM, but they're all about, I'm part of that group, but they're all about kind of evidence-based. That's for gender medicine. Obviously, they're concentrating on medicine, but, you know, obviously the work that you guys are doing. But I think the more writing there is, the more of a body there evidence it is that your sort of social work colleagues can tap into.
Yes,
that can be done kind of vicariously through blame someone else for it, you know, but it's just important to talk, I think, and think together.
Yes, absolutely. I think yeah, I mean, I think tonight it's been really very helpful.
Oh, good.
To me, I think to everybody, there's comments on the chat function just saying that, and somebody's advertised another meeting that is for parents, that's another webinar that's going to be happening. So yeah, I think it's been a really good, interesting discussion. Thank you both very, very much, Sue and Betty.
Thanks.
And yeah, there's a few people.
Thank you.
Really good. So it will be available for people to use, and we will be having another webinar in a month's time, probably. Hopefully, we think it may be about the issue of people who have been prosecuted or lost their jobs or are in danger of losing their jobs. So, but watch this space, EBSWA on Twitter. So thanks to Betty and to Sue and to all of you for participating tonight, and we hope to have you back at future events. And don't all remember to follow and like EBSWA on Twitter and in Facebook, and just help support us bringing this issue out and the evidence base out into social work more broadly. So thanks very much, everybody, and good night.
Thanks for having me. Bye. Bye.
Bye.